The sun was setting as Officer James Harrington rolled his shoulders, trying to work out the stiffness that had settled in after almost 8 hours of patrol. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he took another sip anyway, grimacing at the bitter taste. The radio had been quiet for most of the afternoon, just a few minor traffic stops and a call about a neighbor dispute that resolved itself before he even arrived. James checked his watch. Only 45 minutes left in his shift. He was already thinking about the microwave dinner waiting for him at home and maybe catching the last few innings of the baseball game. The past week had been rough. Budget cuts meant more overtime and fewer officers on each shift. Everyone was overworked and on edge. His radio crackled to life, startling him from his thoughts. All available units, we have a multi-vehicle accident reported on Highway 16, mile marker 42. Multiple injuries reported. Fire and EMS en route. James grabbed his radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 17 responding. ETA 8 minutes. He flipped on his lights and siren, pulling a U-turn in the middle of the quiet suburban street. Across town, Paramedic Darnell Washington was just finishing restocking supplies in his ambulance when the call came in. He and his partner, Lee, had been on duty since 6 a.m., already handling 4 calls, a possible heart attack, an elderly woman who had fallen, a child with a high fever, and a fender bender with minor injuries. Sounds like a bad one, Lee said, jumping into the driver's seat as Darnell closed the back doors of the ambulance. Yeah, Darnell nodded, fastening his seatbelt as Lee hit the siren. Dispatch said at least 3 vehicles involved. Darnell had been a paramedic for almost 8 years now. He'd seen it all, the worst accidents, the miraculous saves, the heartbreaking losses. He'd learned to prepare himself mentally on the way to serious scenes like this. Take deep breaths. Focus on what needed to be done. Don't get overwhelmed by the whole scene. Handle one patient at a time. The ambulance sped through intersections, cars pulling aside to let them pass. Darnell checked his watch. They were making good time. In situations like this, minutes could mean the difference between life and death. My sister drives that stretch every day, Lee said, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Taking her kids to soccer practice. Did you text her? Darnell asked. Lee nodded. She's at home today, but still. I know, Darnell said quietly. That was the thing about this job. Every victim was somebody's someone. A parent, a child, a friend. You couldn't help thinking about your own loved ones. As they approached the scene, Darnell could see the flashing lights ahead. 3 cars were scattered across the highway. One flipped completely upside down, another crumpled against the guardrail, the third spun around facing the wrong direction. Looks like we're first on scene, Lee said, pulling the ambulance to a stop in a position that would protect the crash victims from oncoming traffic. Darnell grabbed his kit and jumped out. I'll start triage. Fire should be here any minute to help with extrication. The smell hit him first, gasoline, burnt rubber, the metallic scent of blood. He scanned the scene, making quick decisions about where to start. A man in the upside-down car wasn't moving. The one in the car against the guardrail was conscious but bleeding from a head wound. He could hear children crying in the third car. As Darnell rushed toward the most critical patient in the upturned vehicle, he noticed a police cruiser speeding toward the scene. Officer Harrington had arrived. Neither man knew it yet, but this accident was about to change both their lives forever. In the chaos of twisted metal and broken glass, their paths were about to collide in ways neither could have imagined when they started their shifts that morning. Darnell took a deep breath and focused on the task at hand. Someone's life depended on what he did in the next few minutes. Everything else would have to wait. Darnell moved quickly through the chaos, the world narrowing to just him and the victims who needed his help. His shoes crunched on broken glass as he approached the overturned car. He crouched down to peer inside, spotting an older man still strapped in his seatbelt, hanging upside down. Sir, can you hear me? I'm a paramedic. Try not to move your head, Darnell called, reaching carefully through the shattered window. The man's eyes fluttered, a good sign. Darnell checked for a pulse, weak but steady. Behind him, Lee was already working on the woman in the second car, speaking in that calm voice he always used with patience. You're going to be okay. Can you tell me where it hurts? Darnell heard the wail of fire trucks in the distance. We've got fire coming, he shouted to Lee. I'm going to need help with extrication here." The sound of boots on pavement made Darnell glance up briefly. Officer Harrington had arrived, his face grim as he took in the accident scene. Their eyes met for just a moment before Darnell turned back to his patient. "Sir, I'm going to put this collar on you to keep your neck stable," Darnell explained, even though he wasn't sure if the man could hear him. He always talked to his patients, conscious or not. It helped keep him focused and, who knows, maybe they could hear him somewhere deep down. The fire truck pulled up and 2 firefighters jogged over. "What have we got?" asked one, kneeling beside Darnell. "Older male, unconscious but breathing. Possible head trauma, unknown other injuries. We need to get him out carefully once he's stabilized." The firefighters nodded, moving to assess how to safely extract the victim from the crumpled car. Officer Harrington paced behind them, tension radiating from him like heat. "What's taking so long?" he barked. "That car could catch fire any minute." "We're working as fast as we safely can," Darnell responded without looking up, his hands steady as he inserted an IV line. The victim needed fluids and possibly blood later. Fire departments checked for leaks. "We can't just yank him out, could paralyze him if there's spinal damage." Harrington scoffed but moved away, directing his attention to controlling the growing crowd of onlookers and passing motorists who had slowed to stare. 20 minutes later, they had carefully extracted the older man from the car and transferred him to a backboard. Darnell's uniform was soaked with sweat. The summer heat combined with the stress of the situation had left dark patches under his arms and down his back. "BP's dropping," Darnell said to Lee as they loaded the man into the ambulance. "We need to move now." In the second ambulance that had arrived, the woman from the guardrail car was already being treated. The family from the third car, a father and 2 young children, had minor injuries and were being checked by another paramedic team. Officer Harrington strode over just as they were about to close the ambulance doors. "I need information for my report," he demanded. "What's the victim's status? Any ID on him?" "Not now," Darnell said firmly. "This patient is critical. I'll radio it in when I can." Harrington's face hardened. "That's not how this works. I said not now," Darnell cut him off. "He's crushing. We need to go." The officer's expression shifted from annoyance to something darker. He stepped closer, invading Darnell's space. "You don't tell me how to do my job." "And you don't tell me how to save a life," Darnell replied, turning away to climb into the back of the ambulance. The tension between them was like a live wire, dangerous and unpredictable. Neither man was willing to back down. Darnell knew every second counted for his patient, while Officer Harrington seemed determined to assert his authority over the scene. As Lee closed the driver's door and started the engine, Darnell focused on stabilizing his patient. The officer's angry face disappeared from view as the ambulance pulled away, sirens blaring. But their confrontation was far from over. The hospital parking lot was busy when the ambulance arrived. Darnell had stabilized the older man during the ride, but his condition was still touch and go. As the emergency room team rushed out to meet them, Darnell gave his report in quick, clear sentences. "Male, approximately 60 years old, found in overturned vehicle. Unconscious at scene with head trauma. BP dropped during transport. We've given fluids and oxygen." The patient disappeared behind the swinging doors, wheeled away by the trauma team. Darnell took a deep breath and wiped his forehead with his sleeve. These moments always left him feeling drained but wired at the same time, the rush of adrenaline slowly fading, leaving a hollow feeling in his chest. "You did good," Lee said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Let's get the rig cleaned up and ready to go. Dispatch already called in another accident on the highway." They were just finishing the cleaning when Officer Harrington's police cruiser pulled into the ambulance bay, parking crookedly across 2 spaces. The officer got out, slamming his door with enough force to make heads turn. His face was tight with anger as he approached the ambulance. "You," he said, pointing at Darnell. "We need to talk about what happened back there." Darnell closed the ambulance doors and turned to face the officer. "I'm kind of busy right now. We have another call waiting." "I don't care," Harrington snapped, stepping closer. "You don't just drive off from a scene without providing proper information. There are protocols." Lee stepped between them, holding up his hands. "Look, officer, we had a critical patient. Standard procedure is tow." I'm not talking to you. Harrington cut him off without even looking at Lee. His eyes were fixed on Darnell, his jaw clenched tight. I'm talking to your partner here who thinks the rules don't apply to him. Darnell felt his own anger rising but forced himself to stay calm. He'd been in situations like this before. The patient was crushing. My priority was getting him to the hospital. I radioed in the details as soon as I could. That's not good enough, Harrington said, his voice rising. Other hospital staff were starting to stare now. You don't get to decide which parts of the job you feel like doing. My job is saving lives, Darnell replied evenly. Everything else comes second. Something in his tone seemed to push Harrington over the edge. The officer stepped forward suddenly, grabbing Darnell's uniformed shirt with both hands and pushing him back against the ambulance. Don't you dare talk to me like that, Harrington growled, his face inches from Darnell's. I'm sick of you people thinking you can just. Let go of me, Darnell said quietly, not struggling against the officer's grip. Now. Lee was already on his radio, calling for backup. A small crowd had gathered, nurses, orderlies, even a doctor who had been heading to his car. Officer, release him immediately, the doctor called out, pulling out his phone to record the incident. Harrington didn't seem to hear any of them. His grip tightened on Darnell's shirt, knuckles white with tension. All I wanted was some basic information, he hissed. But you had to make it difficult. Darnell kept his hands visible at his sides, not giving the officer any excuse to escalate further. Your hands are on me right now, he said calmly. This is assault on a medical professional. Think about what you're doing. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then the hospital security guard approached cautiously. Officer, please step back, he said. Whatever the issue is, we can sort it out without. Fine, Harrington spat, finally releasing Darnell with a small shove. But this isn't over. You'll be hearing from my supervisor about this. Actually, Lee said, his phone in his hand, your supervisor is going to be hearing from us. Harrington's face flushed dark red. He turned and stormed back to his cruiser, nearly hitting a passing car as he pulled out of the parking lot. Darnell straightened his uniform, his heart pounding in his chest despite his outward calm. You okay? Lee asked quietly. I'm fine, Darnell replied, though they both knew he wasn't. Let's just get to the next call. What neither of them realized was that this confrontation was about to get much more complicated. 2 days passed after the confrontation at the hospital. Darnell had filed a report about the incident, though he wasn't sure anything would come of it. He'd been through similar situations before. The paperwork would disappear. Or there would be excuses made, or he'd be told he must have misunderstood the officer's intentions. He tried to push the incident out of his mind as he began his shift on Wednesday morning. The weather had turned stormy, dark clouds hanging low over the city. The kind of day that usually meant car accidents and falls. You hear anything about that cop? Lee asked as they checked their supplies for the day. Darnell shook his head. Nothing yet. Probably nothing will happen. I've got the video from my phone, Lee reminded him. Clear as day, him putting his hands on you. That's not nothing. Before Darnell could answer, their radio crackled with their first call of the day. A possible stroke at a retirement community on the edge of town. They responded quickly, transporting an elderly woman to the hospital. Then came a teenager with a sports injury, followed by a fender bender with minor injuries. It was nearly 3 in the afternoon when dispatch called them to the hospital for a patient transfer. An older male patient needed to be moved from the main hospital to the rehabilitation center across town. Room 412, the nurse told them when they arrived. He's stable but still recovering from a head injury and multiple fractures. Family's been informed of the transfer. Darnell pushed the gurney down the hallway, his mind already on the logistics of the transfer. He knocked lightly on the door of room 412 before entering. The man in the bed looked up as they came in, his face bruised and bandaged, one arm in a cast. Darnell felt a jolt of recognition. It was the man from the overturned car, their patient from the highway accident 2 days ago. Good afternoon, sir, Darnell said, smiling. I'm Darnell, and this is Lee. We're going to be taking you to the rehab center today. The man studied Darnell's face for a moment. You're the paramedic who pulled me from my car, he said, his voice rough but strong. Darnell nodded. That's right. Good to see you awake and talking. You gave us a scare. Robert Harrington, the man said, holding out his good hand. Police chief, retired last month. Though I guess you knew that from my ID. Darnell felt his stomach drop. Harrington. The same last name as the officer who had confronted him. He glanced at Lee, who looked equally shocked. Sorry about the mess, Chief Harrington continued, gesturing at his injuries. Not exactly how I planned to spend my retirement. They carefully transferred him to the gurney, making sure all his IV lines and monitors were secure. As they wheeled him toward the elevator, Darnell's mind was racing. If this was Officer Harrington's father. The elevator doors opened, and Officer Harrington himself stepped out, stopping dead in his tracks when he saw them. For a moment, nobody moved. The officer's eyes widened as he looked from Darnell to the man on the gurney. "Dad," he said, his voice suddenly uncertain. "James?" The chief replied, looking confused. "What are you doing here?" "I told you not to worry about coming until after your shift." Officer Harrington seemed frozen, his face draining of color as he realized who was transporting his father. The man he had shoved against an ambulance 2 days ago was now in charge of his father's care. "You two know each other?" Chief Harrington asked, looking between them. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Darnell could almost see the gears turning in Officer Harrington's head, the realization that the paramedic he had confronted and the man who had saved his father's life were one and the same. "We've met," Darnell said quietly. Officer Harrington swallowed hard, his hand unconsciously moving to his belt where his badge hung. For once, he seemed at a complete loss for words. The chief was looking at his son now, his eyes narrowing slightly. "James, what's going on?" The question hung in the air between them, waiting for an answer that nobody was ready to give. The hallway seemed to shrink around them as the tension grew. Chief Harrington looked between his son and Darnell, his eyes sharp despite his injuries. "I asked you a question, James," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his years as police chief. "What's going on here?" Officer Harrington shifted uncomfortably. "Nothing, Dad. Just surprised to see you being transferred already." His eyes wouldn't meet his father's or Darnell's. Lee cleared his throat. "Sir, we should get moving. The rehab center is expecting you." The chief nodded but kept his eyes on his son. "You can meet us there. Seems like we have some things to discuss." Officer Harrington stepped aside, letting them pass. As Darnell wheeled the gurney past him, their eyes met briefly. The officer's face was a mix of emotions, embarrassment, anger, and something that might have been shame. In the ambulance, Chief Harrington was quiet at first as they secured his gurney and checked his vitals. Then, as they pulled away from the hospital, he spoke. "My son doesn't usually work this district," he said. "He requested the transfer after I retired. Wanted to keep an eye on the old man, I guess." He paused, watching Darnell's face. "So how do you two know each other?" Darnell focused on adjusting the IV line. "We met at an accident scene a couple days ago." "The scene where I was injured," the chief said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." "And something happened between you." Darnell looked up, meeting the chief's eyes. "There was no point in lying. We had a disagreement about protocols at the scene. It escalated at the hospital afterward." The chief nodded slowly. "My son has always had a temper. Gets it from his mother." A small smile crossed his face, then faded. "What kind of escalation are we talking about?" Before Darnell could answer, Lee spoke from the driver's seat. He put his hands on Darnell, sir, grabbed him and pushed him against our rig, in front of witnesses, including hospital staff. The chief closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were full of disappointment. "I see." The rest of the ride passed in uncomfortable silence. When they arrived at the rehab center, a team was waiting to help transfer the chief to his room. As Darnell was finishing the paperwork at the nurse's station, Officer Harrington arrived, striding through the doors with purpose. He hesitated when he saw Darnell, then approached slowly. "Can we talk?" "Outside." Darnell glanced at Lee, who raised his eyebrows in silent question. "I'll be right back," Darnell told him, following the officer to a small garden area outside the center's entrance. For a long moment, Officer Harrington just stood there, looking out at the flower beds. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't know it was my dad in that." The next morning, Darnell woke up earlier than usual. He hadn't slept well, his mind replaying yesterday's events over and over. His phone showed 3 missed calls from the department's HR office and 1 from his supervisor. Word was spreading about the incident. He made coffee and sat at his kitchen table, staring at the rain pattering against the window. His younger brother Tom was still asleep in the next room. Tom had moved in temporarily after losing his job, and Darnell was grateful for the company, even if the apartment felt too small for 2 grown men. His phone buzzed with a text from Lee. Channel 5 just ran a story about police officer confrontation with paramedic. No names yet, but they have a blurry video from someone's phone. Darnell sighed and put the phone down without replying. This was exactly what he didn't want. Attention, cameras, becoming some kind of symbol in the ongoing tension between police and the community. He just wanted to do his job and be treated with basic respect. Across town, Officer Harrington sat in his car outside the rehab facility, gathering courage to go inside. He'd barely slept, his father's questions echoing in his mind. What exactly happened between you and that paramedic, James? I want the truth. He'd made excuses, claimed he was tired, promised to explain everything today. Now today had arrived, and he still didn't know what to say. His phone rang, the station commander. Harrington, we need you to come in. Now. The line went dead before he could respond. Inside the rehab center, Chief Harrington was working with a physical therapist, his jaw set in determination as he tried to stand using a walker. His body was bruised and broken, but his mind was sharp as ever, and he was piecing things together. My son's in trouble, isn't he? He asked the therapist, a young woman who quickly looked away. I wouldn't know about that, sir, she said, helping him back to his wheelchair. Everyone knows something, the chief replied. Small town, big gossip. He'd been police chief for 15 years. He knew how information flowed through the community. I'd like my phone, please. At the police station, Officer Harrington sat across from Commander Wilson, his father's old friend and right-hand man. On the desk between them lay a printed copy of Darnell's incident report and a USB drive. This is bad, James, Wilson said, his voice heavy with disappointment. Very bad. I know, Harrington admitted, staring at his hands. Do you? Because multiple witnesses saw you assault a paramedic who was just doing his job. The same paramedic who saved your father's life. Wilson tapped the USB drive. And now we have video. It's already on the news. Harrington swallowed hard. What happens now? You're suspended, effective immediately. There will be an investigation. Your father. Leave my father out of this, Harrington interrupted. He's got enough to deal with. Wilson's eyebrows rose. You think that's possible? He was police chief for 15 years. People respect him. And now his son. He shook his head. He's already called me 3 times this morning. At the paramedic station, Darnell sat with his supervisor and the department's legal representative. They played him the news clip and explained that he would likely need to give an official statement. You did everything by the book, his supervisor assured him. Your report was clear and factual. Lee's statement matches yours. The hospital staff have corroborated everything. So, why do I feel like I'm the one in trouble? Darnell asked. The legal rep sighed. Because these situations are never simple. There's already talk about this being racially motivated. Was it? His supervisor asked quietly. Darnell thought for a moment. I don't know what was in his head. I just know he didn't treat the other paramedics the same way he treated me. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Robert Harrington. We need to talk. Can you come to the rehab center after your shift? Darnell stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the screen. Whatever choice he made now would shape what happened next, not just for him, but for everyone involved. Finally, he typed, I'll be there at 6. The rehab center was quiet when Darnell arrived after his shift. He'd changed out of his uniform into jeans and a blue button-down shirt. No matter how many times he told himself this was just a conversation, it felt like he was walking into something bigger. A nurse led him to a small garden patio where Chief Harrington sat in his wheelchair, a blanket over his legs despite the warm evening. His son stood nearby, arms crossed, looking uncomfortable. You came, the chief said, sounding pleased. Thank you. Darnell nodded. Your message said we needed to talk. Yes. The chief gestured to a chair. Please, sit down. He looked up at his son. James, could you give us a few minutes? Officer Harrington hesitated, then nodded stiffly and walked away, disappearing around the corner of the building. Once they were alone, the chief sighed deeply. "I've seen the video, and I've read the reports." Darnell said nothing, waiting. "My son was wrong," the chief continued. "Completely, utterly wrong." His voice was steady, matter-of-fact. "And I want you to know that I'm sorry." "You don't need to apologize for him," Darnell said quietly. "No, I don't, and he'll apologize himself properly when he's ready. But I'm not just apologizing for him." The chief's eyes were clear and direct. "I helped create the culture that made him think that behavior was acceptable. 23 years on the force, 15 as chief. I had chances to change things, to make them better. I told myself I was doing enough, but clearly I wasn't." Darnell shifted in his chair. This wasn't what he expected. "The doctor told me what happened at the accident scene," the chief continued. "How you stabilized me, got me out of that car, kept me alive until we reached the hospital. You did everything right, by the book, exactly as you should have." "Just doing my job," Darnell said. "And my son prevented you from doing it, then punished you for doing it well." The chief shook his head. "That's not the police force I thought I was building." In the parking lot, Officer Harrington paced back and forth, his phone pressed to his ear. "I don't know what they're talking about in there," he told Commander Wilson. "Dad wouldn't let me stay." "Give them space," Wilson advised. "Your father knows what he's doing." "What if he's offering him money? Or telling him to sue the department?" Wilson chuckled. "Your father would never undermine the department like that. But he will do what's right. That's always been his way." Back on the patio, the conversation had taken an unexpected turn. "I've been talking to the department all day," Chief Harrington explained. "And I have a proposal. When I'm back on my feet, I want to start a joint training program. Police and emergency services working together in high-stress scenarios." "Like the accident scene," Darnell said, understanding. "Exactly. Too many officers don't understand what paramedics need to do their jobs. And sometimes paramedics don't understand police protocols." The chief leaned forward in his wheelchair. "We need to do better, all of us." "And you want me involved in this?" "I want you to help design it. Your perspective, your experience, they're valuable. We need to hear voices like yours." Darnell thought about it. This wasn't what he'd expected when he'd received the text message. He'd thought maybe the chief wanted to convince him to drop the complaint or to keep things quiet. "What about your son?" he asked. The chief's face grew serious. "James has to face the consequences of his actions. The suspension stands. The investigation continues. He broke the rules, and worse, he broke trust." He paused. "But I hope eventually he can be part of rebuilding that trust." As if on cue, Officer Harrington rounded the corner, his steps hesitant. He looked between his father and Darnell, trying to read their expressions. "Everything okay?" he asked. "We're getting there," his father replied. "Darnell and I have been discussing the future." Officer Harrington nodded slowly. He took a deep breath, then met Darnell's eyes directly for the first time since the hospital. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "What I did was wrong. Completely wrong. I can't take it back, but I want you to know that I regret it." The words hung in the air between them. Not enough to erase what had happened, but maybe enough to start moving forward. Darnell stood up and held out his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Officer Harrington shook it. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning.